The brand of shame. The leaders of Reconstruction were as united against sex as they were in favor of work. During the war, Congress established the American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission to recommend what to do with the emancipated slaves. In its hearings, the commission heard from administrators of the contraband camps that were set up to house black refugees. Colonel William Pyle, who oversaw the camp at Vicksburg, Mississippi, testified that one great defect in the management of the Negroes down there was, as I judged, the ignoring of the family relationship. My judgment is that one of the first things to be done with these people to qualify them for citizenship, for self-protection and self-support, is to impress upon them the family obligations. In its reports to the Secretary of War, the Commission upheld the dominant view among whites that blacks were uncivilized, but it also overturned the assumption that they could not become civilized. Just as it had done for whites during and after the American Revolution, the government and its allies would teach blacks to whip themselves. For the newly freed slave, the law, in the shape of military rule, takes for him the place of his master, with this difference, that he submits to it more heartily and cheerfully without any sense of degradation. There was no more effective mechanism for this transformation than marriage, the great lever by which the freed men and women are to be lifted up and prepared for a state of civilization. Met with near unanimous endorsement among Union leaders, the Commission's recommendations were put into practice. Federal officials running the contraband camps were instructed, among the things to be done to fit the freed people for a life of happiness and usefulness, it was obvious that the inculcation of right principles and practices in regard to the social relations ought to find a place. For ex-slaves under the care of the Union government, non-marital sexual relations were outlawed. In April 1863, John Eaton, the federal director of the camps, reported that all entering our camps who have been living or desire to live together as husband and wife are required to be married in the proper manner. This regulation has done much to promote the good order of the camp. Thereafter, superintendents of the contraband camps reported that the introduction of the right of Christian marriage and requiring its strict observance exerted a most wholesome influence upon the order of the camps and the conduct of the people. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton formally endorsed Eaton's rule and ordered Freedmen's Bureau agents to solemnize the right of marriage among freed men. Local administrators were ordered to coerce ex-slaves into marriage so as to bring them into civilization. The past marriages of freedmen, although often formally solemnized, have not been so authenticated that misconduct can be legally punished or inheritance rightly determined. It is most urgently and plainly needful that this outgrowth of a bygone system should now cease. A general remarriage, for the sake of the record, of all persons married without license or living together without marriage should be insisted upon by employers and urged by all who have any connection with or knowledge of such persons. They should know that, if after simple facilities have been for some time afforded, they have not conformed to this necessity of social life, they will be prosecuted and punished. After its establishment at the end of the war, one of the first missions of the Freedmen's Bureau was to eliminate the sexual freedom of slaves. Just a few months after it began operations, in the summer of 1865, the Bureau issued marriage rules to aid the freedmen in properly appreciating and religiously observing the sacred obligations of the marriage state. The rules not only granted the legal right to marry to ex-slaves, but also established the rules of marriage for them, including eligibility for marriage and for divorce, and, most significantly, made marriage, like it was already for free whites, an obligation. No parties will be allowed to live together as husband and wife until their marriage has been legally solemnized. Ex-slaves were warned by Bureau officials that the loose ideas which have prevailed among you on this subject must cease, and that no race of mankind can be expected to become exalted in the scale of humanity whose sexes, without any binding obligation, cohabit promiscuously together. The books that were read aloud by Freedmen's Bureau teachers to the ex-slaves were filled with attacks on non-marital sex. When you were slaves, you took up with each other, and were not taught what a bad thing it was to break God's law of marriage, intoned, plain counsels for freedmen. But now you can only be sorry for the past, and begin life anew and on a pure foundation. God will not wink at adultery and fornication among you now. Black women who as slaves were not punished or shamed for non-marital sex, but who would be the foundation of any future black family structure, received fiery warnings. Let it be your first aim to make of yourself a true woman. Allow no man, under any pretense, to despoil you of your virtue. The brand of shame rests upon the brow of the unchaste woman. She is hated, even by those who are as bad as she is. No man can ever love her. If in your slave life you have been careless of your morals, now that you are free, live as becomes a free Christian woman. Stamp a lie upon the common remark that colored women are all bad. Avoid the company of bad men and women. Do not go with a man who does not care for the virtue of a woman. Keep away from gamblers. Never be found in the company of a woman who cares nothing about a good name. Lewd women will lead you down quick into hell. Now, if you wish to build upon the solid rock, to be on good terms with yourself, to be able to look every man in the face, and to have peace with your God, keep yourselves pure, avoid all vice, and especially all those things which are forbidden by the wholesome laws of society. The ending of an unsatisfactory relationship among slaves did not bear the stigma that was attached to divorce among Americans. But the ex-slaves were told to never leave their spouses. As John Freeman told Clarissa on the day of liberation, "White folks always gets married with the book, and the minister, and a heap of ceremony like, and the man says yes, and the woman says yes, and they vow it before the Lord, and then they live together, and nothing can ever separate them. Now let's you and I do that way, and begin all over new, like free folks." As with the work ethic, many ex-slaves willfully, even eagerly, adopted the new sexual ethic. Thousands of freed men and women rushed to get married after the war, and countless perfectly respectable black families emerged across the nation. Black political leaders and ministers uniformly endorsed the new rules. One minister counseled his people, "Let us do nothing to rekindle the slumbering fires of prejudice between the two races. Remember, we are on trial before the tribunal of the nation and of the world, that it may be known whether we are worthy to be a free, self-governing people." But despite the incessant moralizing by their leaders and protectors, many of the freed men maintained their own ideas about marriage, relationships, and sex. Agent reports flooded into bureau offices complaining that the freed men and women persisted in the disgusting practice of living together as man and wife without proper marriage, living together and calling themselves man and wife as long as it conveniently suits them, and maintaining bigamous or adulterous relationships. In many instances, wrote one agent, where after being legally and lawfully married they lived together but a short time. Separate and marry again, or live together without any obligation at all. Time and again the agents complained that blacks continued to act as they did in time of slavery, clinging to old habits of an immoral character. They could barely contain their frustration with the continued practice of taking up with a person without a lifetime commitment. It would appear to be more difficult to change their ideas in this matter than on any other affecting their welfare, wrote Alvin Gillum, who headed the Bureau in Mississippi in 1868. Freedmen's Bureau agents frequently reported their dismay with the manner in which freed people ignored the requirements of the law, even when they were fully aware of its technical demands. A local agent in Mississippi wrote in 1867 that he would hear of men leaving their wives and running away with other women to parts unknown, and some women leaving their husbands, taking up with other men. I feel confident these acts are not done through ignorance of the law in such cases, but more from the want of a will to comply with the law. I have explained the law to them with reference to adultery, etc., but without much avail. Another bureau officer could scarcely believe that many freedmen considered having more than one sexual partner to be a right which no one has a right to interfere with. Chaplain C. W. Buckley, the assistant superintendent of freedmen in Montgomery, Alabama, reported that he was pained daily by the sexual relations among ex-slaves. Husbands and wives are separating at a fearful rate and taking up with other persons. Not infrequently a man is living with 2 or 3 wives. Though this had been the custom of the race and habit of the country for years, yet it cannot be looked upon in any light than a huge system of prostitution by sane persons. But coercion had only a limited effect on people who apparently did not want to live like the Freemans. The Virginia Assistant Commissioner reported, despite the Bureau's massive efforts to domesticate the freedmen, indifference and repugnance of the Negro to registering in reference to marriage, for both men and women still have an aptitude for change of their marriage relationships, and their animal propensities are so strong that they heed not the consequences of the change. To be sure, many freed people searched for spouses who had been taken from them by sale. But many freedmen, as one bureau official observed, now take advantage of their freedom to get rid of their old wives and allege as a reason that they were not married by the book. One Virginia officer said it well when he reported that many ex-slaves were displeased with legal marriage, thinking their liberties very much curtailed by their freedom. Frustrated bureau agents successfully lobbied Southern state legislators to legally mandate marriage for black couples. Many of the state's civil rights laws passed during Reconstruction included what historian Catherine Franks has called the automatic marriage statute. The Mississippi Civil Rights Law passed in 1865 contained the standard language, "All freedmen, free Negroes and mulattoes, who do now and have heretofore lived and cohabitated together as husband and wife, shall be taken and held in law as legally married." Freedmen's bureau agents monitored the living and sexual arrangements of ex-slaves and turned in alleged adulterers, bigamists, and fornicators to local authorities for prosecution under local criminal laws. Gillum asked law enforcement officials in Mississippi to jail ex-slaves who engaged in deplorable activities. He explained to the Washington Bureau Office in September 1868 that, "I have caused the proper steps to be taken to bring this matter before the civil courts, and shall urge that offenders be brought to trial and punished." After all, Gillum maintained, the purpose of the Bureau's marriage rules was to enforce matrimony between tens of thousands of freed people. One woman, when asked why she had legally married a man she already considered to be her husband when they were slaves, explained, "They were arresting people that did not have a ceremony between them." As with white citizens in the early Republic, new black citizens, after the Civil War, were suddenly punished for producing children out of wedlock. Thousands of black, unmarried mothers and fathers were arrested, fined, imprisoned, or suspended by their thumbs. Countless black children were labeled bastards, placed in orphanages, and made wards of the state. This was an entirely new punishment for people who, when they were in a state of what was called bondage, thought nothing was shameful or illegitimate about unmarried parents. White Reconstruction. Moral rules for white Americans during Reconstruction were no less severe. White children were pummeled by moral injunctions to work. The most widely used school book in the mid-19th century, McGuffey's Reader, taught children to read with stories and poems such as Lazy Ned, about a boy who would never take the pains to seek the prize that labor gains until the time had passed. For all his life he dreaded still the silly bugbear of uphill, and died a dance at last. McGuffey's stories also warned its young readers to shun the choices of the idle schoolboy who was indolent about everything and now goes about the streets begging his bread, and the laggard who ended up despised by everyone. A poor wanderer without money and without friends. Such tales were intended to instruct American children how sinful and ruinous it is to be idle, and to create a culture in which work was a constant, haunting presence. The idle boy is almost invariably poor and miserable. The industrious boy is happy and prosperous. But perhaps some child who reads this asks, does God notice little children in school? He certainly does. And if you are not diligent in the improvement of your time, it is one of the surest evidences that your heart is not right with God. You are placed in this world to improve your time. In youth, you must be preparing for future usefulness, and if you do not improve the advantages you enjoy, you sin against your Maker. A poem featured in a popular school reader for girls, Exhortation to Diligence, was typically morbid. Toil and be glad, let industry inspire into your quickened limbs her buoyant breath. Who does not act is dead, absorbed entire. In miry sloth, no pride, no joy he hath. O leaden-hearted men, to be in love with death. Moral commands to labor continued to rain down on Americans in adulthood. Abraham Lincoln, like virtually all political leaders in the period, demonstrated the effects of this. On the eve of the Civil War, he wrote to a friend, "Work, work, work is the main thing." In 1876, as Reconstruction neared its end and a depression crippled much of Northern industry, Washington Gladden, who was both a leader of the freedmen's education movement and a leading proponent of labor reform in the North, authored a book of friendly advice to the white working man that was virtually identical to the freedmen's textbooks. Shovel dirt, saw wood, do any kind of reputable work, rather than abide in idleness. Gladden counseled, "The only relief for our present distress will come through industry and frugality, through a chastening of our ambitious notions of life and the cultivation of simpler tastes and a more contented spirit." In 1878, an employer of shoemakers in Massachusetts voiced the general view when he defended the maintenance of 10- and 11-hour workdays by claiming, "Nothing saves men from debauchery and crime so much as labor, and that till one is tired and ready to return to the domestic joys and duties of home." Leaders of government widely agreed with this assessment, as did the Ohio Bureau of Labor in 1879. Labor is not a curse. It is not the hours per day that a person works that breaks him down, but the hours spent in dissipation. Give men plenty to do and a long while to do it in, and you will find them physically and morally better. Even leaders of trade unions endorsed the work ethic. The Knights of Labor, which became the leading labor organization soon after Reconstruction, required new members to recite the following declaration as part of an oath of initiation. In the beginning, God ordained that men should labor not as a curse, but as a blessing, not as a punishment, but as a means of development, physically, mentally, morally, and has set thereunto his seal of approval in the rich increase and reward. Labor is noble and holy, to glorify God in its exercise, to defend it from degradation, to divest it of the evils to body, mind, and estate which ignorance and greed have imposed. To rescue the toiler from the grasp of the selfish is a work worthy of the noblest and best of our race. As we will see in Chapter 9, leaders of the American labor movement promoted reductions of the workday and work week, not because they were opposed to work, but because they loved it as much as the employers. They argued that the problem with excessive hours was that they made it difficult to persuade employees of the glory of work. Quitting time. Black people weren't the only Americans who violated the rules of Reconstruction. For one thing, they did not have a monopoly on shiftlessness. Though many white Americans had made themselves into the hardest workers in the world, fortunately, great numbers had been ignoring and resisting the work ethic since the Revolution. When the first factories were built, with their regimented work rules and long hours, many of the white people employed in them proved to be terrible workers. Among the very first factories built in the United States were the Hamilton Company mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, which employed only women. Within 2 years of its founding in 1825, more than half the workforce had been fired for the following reasons. 6 were discharged for misconduct. 5 were discharged for mutiny. 3 were discharged for disobedience to orders. 1 was discharged for impudence to the overseer. 1 was discharged for levity. 1 would not do her duty. 5 were discharged for lying, misrepresentation, or circulating false stories. 1 was discharged for captiousness. 1 ran away. 1 was hysterical. 1 had written after her name emphatically, regularly discharged forever. Cobblers in the first shoe factories in Lynn, Massachusetts, stopped work for games, political debates, to hear one another read from a newspaper, and to shuffle off to the grog shop. A factory superintendent in Chicopee, Massachusetts, complained of the general indisposition of his employees to work steady. Informal renegade behaviors often created enormous margins of freedom in people's lives. The men who built barrels, one of the major industries of the early American economy, were normally paid for 6 days of work. But on Saturday they began drinking beer in the morning, then would sit around upturned barrels playing poker, and generally lounged about until they received their weekly pay. According to a historian of the industry, the partying continued into the evening as Saturday night was a big night for the old-time cooper. Usually the good time continued over into Sunday, so that on the following day he usually was not in the best of condition to settle down to the regular day's work. Therefore, Blue Monday was spent doing very little and was, more or less, lost as far as production was concerned. Simply by being lazy, the coopers made for themselves a 4-day work week and a 3-day weekend. Employers regularly complained of such behavior in the 19th century. During Reconstruction, the complaints mounted as workers from pre-modern cultures in Europe began to come in masses to the United States. Immigrant workers in New York City shipyards infuriated their bosses by taking breaks for cake, candy, trips to saloons for whiskey, and leisurely lunches. British-born workers in New Jersey pottery factories were known to work in great bursts of activity and then disappear for several days at a time. Immigrants also continued the early American tradition of informal 3-day weekends. Monday, said one employer, was given up to debauchery. A cigar manufacturer complained in 1877 that his employees spent more time slacking than working. The difficulty with many cigar makers is this. They come down to the shop in the morning, roll a few cigars, and then go to a beer saloon and play Pinocchio or some other game, working probably only 2 or 3 hours a day. Going out. Abolitionists and the leaders of Reconstruction relaunched another of their projects after the Civil War, and as with the reformation of the slaves, achieved only mixed results. The temperance movement, stalled momentarily by the exigencies of the war, took flight again after the Confederate surrender. Leaders of the new movement coalesced as the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1874. Activists in the campaign to purge America of demon rum not only continued to lobby for legal prohibition, but also began invading saloons and demanding that the patrons put down their cups forever. Some barmen threw fruits, vegetables, eggs, and handfuls of sawdust from the floor at the reformers. Others cursed at them, threatened them with violence, loosed dogs on them, or baptized them with buckets of beer. In brew-loving Cincinnati, when the local WCTU threatened to protest against the existence of a beer garden, the owner mounted an old cannon at the entrance to his place and threatened to blow the ladies to kingdom come. American consumption of alcohol did decline after the Civil War from its previous stratospheric levels, but the nation remained very much an alcoholic republic. In the 10 years between the founding of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865 and the founding of the WCTU in 1874, when citizens and those being trained for citizenship were told to avoid public places of sin and renounce personal pleasure, 62 million gallons of liquor were consumed in the United States. And in the first 10 years of the WCTU's existence, the figure rose to 76 million gallons. Another post-war moral reform institution with many former abolitionists and supporters of Reconstruction was the Young Men's Christian Association, whose mission was to protect the new urban masses from the sins of the city. It had its work cut out for it. In 1866, the YMCA counted in New York City alone 8,000 saloons, 700 brothels, 4,000 prostitutes, and numerous sellers of pornography. The American pleasure culture experienced a renaissance after the war. Rather than heed the demands of citizenship, millions of Americans instead supported with their cash a vast proliferation of beer halls, brothels, dance halls, billiard rooms, pleasure gardens, concert saloons, and variety theaters. The last two have been described by one historian as bar rooms with free or cheap entertainment offered in adjacent back rooms, halls, or theaters. The major source of revenue in the concert saloons was the sale of alcohol, with prostitution an important sideline. The typical establishment with the floor filled with peanut shells and spilt beer. The air saturated with tobacco smoke was correctly described by moral reformers as a gateway to sexual misbehavior. Not only were prostitutes staple attractions, but the staged performances nearly always included bawdy or purple acts featuring America's first professional strippers. The historian Timothy J. Guilfoyle has called the years between 1836 and 1871 the halcyon years of commercialized sex. The Promise. The leaders of Reconstruction demonstrated that they were deadly serious about making the ex-slaves into citizens with a series of truly radical policies. Just before nullifying the Black Codes, the Republican-controlled Congress proposed a 14th Amendment to the Constitution that defined American citizenship as belonging to anyone born in the United States or to anyone naturalized. The proposed amendment also stated that all citizens were entitled to all the privileges and immunities guaranteed by the Constitution, including, most importantly, equal protection of the laws by both the state and national governments. The 14th Amendment moved 4 million people from slavery to full citizenship, virtually overnight. In the winter and spring of 1867, Congress passed 3 breathtakingly aggressive Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's vetoes. The bill divided the South, except for Tennessee, which was readmitted into the Union only because it had agreed to ratify the 14th Amendment, into 5 military districts and gave supreme authority over those districts to officers of the United States Army. Even more radical, the Reconstruction Acts limited suffrage to all black men and to white men who had not participated in the rebellion. At first, about 1/4 of all white men in the South were excluded from suffrage. This created black voting majorities in several states. Congress mandated that a state could be readmitted into the Union only if its construction included provisions for black suffrage and if its legislature ratified not only the 14th Amendment, but also a new 15th Amendment, which made illegal the denial of suffrage to any citizen on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. By 1870, all the states of the former Confederacy had submitted to the demands of Reconstruction. The immediate result was that in every former slave state, black men held public office during Reconstruction, including 20 in the U.S. House of Representatives, 2 in the Senate, and hundreds in state legislatures. This was a remarkable transformation in Southern politics. Other accomplishments were stunning in their scope and ambition. The Freedmen's Bureau established nearly 4,000 schools in which approximately 200,000 ex-slaves received the first formal education of their lives. Spending by the Republican-controlled state governments increased geometrically as roads, hospitals, prisons, asylums for orphans and the insane, and public schools were built all over the South. Though most state governments distributed very little land to the ex-slaves, South Carolina gave land to 14,000 black families in an effort to fulfill Thaddeus Stevens' hope that independent farming would elevate the character of the freed man. Republicans fiercely protected ex-slaves from vigilante violence. In 1871, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Ku Klux Klan Act, which empowered federal troops to arrest Klansmen and gave jurisdiction in such cases to federal courts, where juries were often predominantly black. The subsequent prosecution and imprisonment of hundreds of Klan members effectively destroyed the KKK as an organization. But support for the Reconstruction Project began to fade in the 1870s. Many Republicans complained that the ex-slaves were not taking on the responsibilities of citizenship. The journalist and former abolitionist James S. Pike toured South Carolina and reported with dismay that despite the injunctions of freedmen's teachers and agents to work at least 6 full days per week, ex-slaves in Charleston average about 4 days' labor in the week. Other freedmen showed that they were habitually guilty of thieving and of concubinage. Granting the rights of citizenship to people who did not adopt the cultural restraints of citizenship had resulted in the rule of ignorance, barbarism, and vice. Pike's report, which was widely read by Republican politicians, caused many to abandon hope of remaking the Black Renegades. Carl Schurz, a leading Republican senator and early supporter of Reconstruction, stated in 1872 that the inevitable consequence of the admission of so large an uneducated and inexperienced class to political power was the probable mismanagement of the material interests of the social body, as well as political corruption and demoralization and financial ruin. By 1872, there was so much frustration with making the ex-slaves into citizens that the Freedmen's Bureau was abolished. Over the next 5 years, the Democrats steadily regained power as, one by one, the Republicans lost their will to remake the Southern states. By 1876, the demoralized Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for giving the presidency to Republican Rutherford B. Hayes in an election that had gone to Congress because of a dispute over which party had won the most electoral votes. By the end of 1877, all of the military power that had kept the Reconstruction state governments in power were removed from the South. The turn against Reconstruction has been interpreted as the Republicans' submerged racism coming to the surface and as evidence that they were never fully committed to making ex-slaves into citizens. This interpretation implies that the ex-slaves complied with the rules of citizenship and were therefore cheated of their place in American society. But even if they were motivated by racism, and some of them surely were, Schurz and the Republicans who complained of the freedmen's behavior were correct. Many, and possibly most of the ex-slaves, did not take on the responsibilities of citizenship, did not restrain their personal freedoms, did not devote their lives to work, monogamy, frugality, and discipline. Their attitudes and behaviors delayed the project begun by the Founding Fathers, continued by the abolitionists, and made comprehensive by the leaders of Reconstruction, of making us into the enemies of our own freedom. And for this, I suggest, we should celebrate them. The gift. Something was let loose with the slaves. Something described by W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction in America as a magical gift. A great song arose, the loveliest thing born this side the seas. It was a new song. It did not come from Africa, though the dark throb and beat of that ancient of days was in it and through it. It did not come from white America, never from so pale and hard and thin a thing, however deep these vulgar and surrounding tones had driven. Not the Indies nor the hot South, the cold East or heavy West made that music. It was a new song, and its deep and plaintive beauty, its great cadences and wild appeal wailed, throbbed, and thundered on the world's ears with a message seldom voiced by man. They sneered at it, those white Southerners who heard it and never understood. They raped and defiled it, those white Northerners who listened without ears. Yet it lived and grew, always it grew and swelled and lived, and it sits today at the right hand of God as America's one real gift to beauty, as slavery's one redemption, distilled from the dross of its dung. To Du Bois, slavery kept African Americans out of the culture of repression that whites had created, and because of this, slaves created a uniquely liberated culture that valued pleasure over work and freedom over conformity. Du Bois argued that there were some ex-slaves who behaved like John Freeman, but many did not, and to Du Bois, the culture of the slaves that was let loose by emancipation was a gift to America and the world. In fact, during Reconstruction, many ex-slaves fled the fields for cities, where they found horns and formed jubilee bands. Many discovered pianos and invented a music called ragtime that set millions of white feet dancing, and others picked up guitars and began to play a music we call the blues. Out of that alchemy emerged a gift to all those who hated work, loved pleasure, and yearned to be as free as a child. The great tragedy of Reconstruction, according to Du Bois, was that so many whites turned down the gift, sneered at black culture, and mocked it, and chose to consider it inferior. But Du Bois, like most historians today, nonetheless wished that the ex-slaves had been made into full American citizens. What he did not understand was that John Freeman and all the ex-slaves who chose citizenship turned down a gift as well. If Reconstruction had been fully realized, many of the freedoms and joys given to us by the slaves would have been taken away. If the freed men had been made into citizens, there would be no jazz